What's happening, guys? So Z900RS, what modifications work the best? What would I suggest? And are there any that I would steer clear from? Well, let's dive into that. First and foremost, congratulations if you've got one of these bikes. I absolutely love my 2023 Z900RS Cafe. Now, I liked it plenty just fine stock, but it really needed a bit more. It needed to be a bit more lively. The nannies, the limiters needed to be removed, but more importantly, I wanted to uncork the potential of this awesome 948cc inline four. I wanted it to run properly. I wanted it to sound a certain way. And well, quite frankly, I wanted it to run like a bike that looks that good should be allowed to run. So what all have I done? Well, I think at this stage of the game, everything. And that's exactly what I would suggest, provided that you are not a rider that's taking it more easy, somebody that's basically just using it to cruise around. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, this bike does a very good job of that. Matter of fact, it was kind of made for that returning rider, maybe the older rider that's looking really more for style than performance. But there is quite a bit of performance to be unlocked if you decide to do it. So what I've done with my bike is I have put a 16-tooth front sprocket. That's larger, by the way. We'll get to some details on that in a minute. But getting back to the menu list, the larger front sprocket, the Brock's Street Meg full exhaust. It's got a tune by Ivan's Performance. It's got the airbox modifications, which are drilling holes in the lower portion of the box for a little bit better airflow. It's got a divider removed that helps the airbox breathe better. It's got all RS, which is the motorcycle specific, the slightly longer velocity stacks, but I've removed the two center very long stacks in favor of those middle velocity stacks. And it does extremely well. Well, that high flow air filter and a G2 quick throttle. All of those modifications, it sounds like a lot, and it is, but it completely transforms how this motorcycle rides. That 16-tooth front sprocket, coupled with the tune and the G2 quick throttle, make the motorcycle feel a lot more natural to you if you're coming from an old school leader bike platform. Well, first gear is a lot longer, but because you've got the tune and you've got the limiters removed, and you've got that G2 quick throttle, you have all the throttle response you can deal with this motorcycle, believe me. But it doesn't lose anything to that 16-tooth sprocket. It still feels very strong, but you just have a lot longer legs to run with. It's really a win-win in my opinion. Plus, the added power doesn't hurt. Right now, with all of the aforementioned modifications, this bike tries to float the front wheel in third gear. Makes it pretty nice. It won't do that stock. But all of these modifications do come at a price, and it's fairly hefty. You start adding up all of these modifications and you find out that you spent quite a bit, but you get quite a bit. And in return, you get a motorcycle that, at least in my opinion, acts, runs, sounds the way that a proper 70s or early 80s cafe hot rod should. Now remember, guys, this is still more or less based around a Z900 platform, not necessarily a full-on sport bike, but still sporty enough. This bike handles just fine, and unless you're trying to do track attack style speed runs, this little weapon is an absolute peach to play with. It gives a ton of feedback without being overly aggressive, although I will admit there are times where a steering stabilizer or maybe a little bit different steering geometry would be okay, but you know what? That's not why we buy these bikes. We buy them because they look like this. And all of those extra twitches and jiggles, that just keeps me engaged with the bike, and it actually makes me want to push it and ride it harder. I have other motorcycles in the fleet that will sit down and go through corners just fine and are sport bike platforms, but they never give quite the feedback. And speaking of going through corners and feedback, you notice I didn't say anything about replacing the rear shock or the rear spring or fork cartridges or anything like that. Done a whole lot of suspension tuning, but I haven't replaced any of the stock components. I don't feel like I need to. at least with my riding style, which is admittedly, in some cases, very aggressive, I've never really needed more than what this bike can deliver. I check in without gear at about 190 pounds, so that'll give you an idea for what I'm working with. I try to hit every on-road or off-road, not off-road, on-ramp or off-ramp. I try to hit those pretty aggressively. I'm not dragging a knee, but that'll give you an idea for how I like to ride this bike. So, no real suspension modifications, just the suspension settings. I've got my rear spring set to about 187 millimeters. I can go through the suspension settings for me, but that's just more of a subjective thing. But that'll give you an idea for preload for my weight. I've also made a slight difference with the handlebars. I've rotated them, I guess you could say, towards me if you were to roll it on a table, but I've rolled them down just a little bit. Gives a little bit more of an aggressive stance, allows a little bit more weight over that front tire when I'm hanging off of this thing doing stuff that I don't know, maybe I ought not to be doing with a bike like this. But you know what? It does it. This bike is a lot more capable than you might give it credit for. If you're confident in your machine, you can typically get a lot more out of it. This bike has been incredibly confidence inspiring, and for, again, the type of riding that I like to do is spot on. But is there a modification that I would not recommend? I would recommend doing everything, and the one modification I would not want to do, again, was to tune it with a full exhaust with the center long velocity stacks still in the airbox. Guys, I was of the same mindset that you may be, where, well, I don't want to lose any torque, I don't want to lose any rideability or something like that. It doesn't happen. This bike with the short stacks are, to say that it is a proper four-cylinder, the way that it feels, the way that it sounds, the way that it rips to 10,000 RPM now, where it would not do that before, that to me is exactly why you would want a bike like this. And to my uncalibrated butt dyno, the bike hasn't lost any torque anywhere. It flat out screams now. It howls the way that I remember my dad's old Z1 howling back when I was a kid. So for me, equalizing that intake setup, having this type of an exhaust with a bike that looks like that, now I've got the sound, the performance, I've got everything that I could ever want out of this bike. But do all of the mods. Don't just do one. Don't try to get away with tuning it or, well, I'm just going to put exhaust in a tune and leave it alone. Guys, don't do that. Do all the modifications if you want to get the most out of this bike. It will completely transform it into a properly fast motorcycle if that is what you're going for. And for you guys that bought one and decided to keep it stock, you're just chilling with it and you're just having fun with it the way that it sits, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But at some point, if you decide to make a move and start to really dive into modifying this bike, do all of it and you won't look back. And with that, guys, post up your comments. Let me know what you're up to with your Cowie, and we'll catch you on the next one. Adios.